The morning I bought the lake, the world was silent, except for the sound of wind brushing through cattails and the soft ripples touching the shore. I remember standing there with the deed in my hand, feeling like I had just claimed peace itself. The sun was still low, painting gold over still water, and for the first time in years, I felt free. No more meetings, no more HOA notices taped to my door. Just quiet. Across the narrow road stood Willow Creek Estates, a perfect line of white-trimmed houses, all ruled by the same people who once made my life miserable. Their lawns were flawless, their smiles rehearsed, and their rules endless. I used to live there, before they decided my old wooden deck was unsightly. Before they fined me for planting wildflowers instead of approved perennials. Before Karen, the HOA president, turned my peace into paperwork. But that morning, I wasn't their neighbor anymore. I was the man who owned the lake that bordered their precious community, and they didn't even know it yet. The water shimmered like a secret. I could almost hear the laughter that used to drift from the HOA's private dock, the dock they thought they owned. In truth, their dock jutted a few feet too far. Just enough to rest on my new property. Just enough to change everything. I watched as Karen's silver SUV pulled up across the shore, her usual morning jog paused when she saw me standing there. Her expression tightened, curiosity, confusion, then disbelief. I waved politely, but she didn't wave back. She just stood there, squinting at the lake as if the water itself had betrayed her. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of construction from the far side, new homes rising, new rules waiting to be written. But here, where the water met the reeds, there was only silence, and opportunity. That day, I didn't say a word. I just smiled, folded the deed, and walked back to my truck. Because deep down, I already knew, the HOA would come knocking. And when they did, I'd be ready. I grew up in the quiet suburb of Willow Creek Estates, where every house was identical, every lawn pristine, and every neighbor's life meticulously curated. My first home was a modest little place near the corner, surrounded by maples that turned gold every fall. At first, it felt like a sanctuary. Kids played in the streets, mail carriers waved hello, and the scent of fresh-cut grass was a constant reminder of small-town comfort. But behind the white picket fences and smiling faces, something subtle, almost invisible, festered. The HOA wasn't just an organization, it was an invisible hand that dictated behavior, taste, and even personality. At first, I didn't mind. I liked rules when they were fair. I even liked Karen, in her perfectly pressed suits and authoritative posture. She was persuasive, organized, and, to some degree, charismatic. Everyone admired her, or feared her. Life was simple then. I had a few close friends, neighbors who shared tools, barbecues on weekends, and stories that stretched late into warm summer nights. My wife, Lena, and I would sit on our porch sipping iced tea, listening to the distant sounds of children laughing, imagining that life would always stay this serene. But cracks began to appear, subtle at first. Letters slipped under doors citing non-compliance with arbitrary rules. Complaints about my garden being too wild or my deck not conforming to aesthetic standards started to accumulate. A friend's dog was fined for digging a hole too deep. Another neighbor was warned for painting their door the wrong shade of gray. It was small at first, almost laughable, but the pattern became unmistakable. I learned quickly, the HOA thrived on control, and Karen was the queen of their quiet tyranny. Every meeting felt orchestrated, citizens presenting complaints, Karen nodding with feigned sympathy, and decisions made behind closed doors that seemed designed to benefit a select few. At first, I tried to comply. I trimmed my hedges, repainted my fence, even stopped planting the wildflowers I loved so much. But it never ended. There was always another violation waiting, another fine. I remember the first direct confrontation with Karen vividly. It was a crisp October morning. I had installed a small, wooden deck in the backyard, meant for quiet evenings and a view of the little creek behind my property. Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, voice calm but sharp. "This deck is not approved," she said. "It violates HOA standards. You have 30 days to remove it." I was stunned. I asked her how a small wooden platform, painted the same color as my fence, could possibly be a violation. She smiled, as if explaining a child's mistake. "The HOA rules allow for uniformity. This deck isn't uniform. It disrupts the visual harmony." It felt absurd, and yet, she had the power to make it true. And so did the board. My peaceful mornings turned into anxiety-filled afternoons. I began checking every letter, every rulebook, every obscure clause hidden deep in HOA regulations. The realization was heavy: no matter what I did, my life in Willow Creek Estates would never be truly my own. Even friends weren't safe from her influence. People who once laughed with me about minor HOA absurdities suddenly grew quiet, hesitant, afraid to associate too closely with someone who was non-compliant. I felt isolation creeping in. Lena tried to keep things light, suggesting trips or small escapes, but even she couldn't hide her worry. We were trapped by invisible rules, and Karen had mastered them. Then came the warning signs that made me question more than just rules. A surveyor appeared on our property one morning, clipboard in hand, claiming to be measuring the creek's boundaries. I asked for identification. None was produced. He left after a tense exchange, but not before a shadow of doubt had settled in my mind. Something wasn't right. The creek, which had always been a quiet haven, felt suddenly surveilled, monitored. Rumors started circulating, too. Whispers of secret HOA deals, of neighbors selling out for perks or positions, of land slowly shifting hands without transparency. I heard them in passing, at grocery stores, at school events, even during casual walks. At first, I dismissed them as paranoia. But a creeping unease had taken root. By the time Lena and I decided to step back and truly observe, patterns emerged. Neighbors quietly giving permission for new restrictions, small parcels of land being reassigned, deeds quietly amended, all under the HOA's gaze. And Karen, always at the center, orchestrating it like a conductor, smiling politely while moving pieces on her invisible chessboard. Despite the growing tension, there were moments of genuine human connection. My friendship with Mr. Alvarez, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood since the 70s, reminded me of what Willow Creek could have been. He'd tell stories of when neighbors looked out for each other without fear of fines or inspections. He warned me gently about Karen, never overdramatic, just a quiet truth: control isn't always visible. It's the silence you hear before someone tells you what you must do. Even with all this, life went on. We still hosted small barbecues, painted pumpkins on Halloween, and shared laughs with those who dared. But the shadows lingered. The HOA's rules, Karen's gaze, the subtle coercion, it was a constant weight. And then, one late afternoon, something happened that shifted everything from discomfort to alarm. I noticed a truck parked near the creek's edge, survey equipment laid out, and a man taking notes along the shoreline. He didn't respond when I approached, merely nodded and continued measuring. Something was being recorded, catalogued, perhaps manipulated. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about control, ownership, and power. And I was no longer certain my little world was safe. That night, as I lay awake listening to the wind rustle through the trees, Lena whispered, "Maybe it's time to leave." I didn't answer. Instead, I made a quiet promise to myself: I won't be bullied. Not quietly. Not ever again. And that's when I began to notice a detail that would change everything: a plot of land on the edge of Willow Creek, untouched, unclaimed, outside HOA jurisdiction. It was small, yes, but it bordered a lake, a pristine, quiet lake that the HOA had never controlled. It was perfect. I didn't know it yet, but the moment I decided to buy that lake, the slow game of revenge had begun. The first time I realized just how far Karen and the HOA were willing to go, it wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches or confrontations, just quiet, almost imperceptible deception that hit like a cold wave. It started with a letter I found tucked into the mailbox one crisp morning. The envelope was official-looking, stamped with the HOA seal, but the content was unusual. It referenced a discrepancy in property boundaries, and demanded that I allow access to my backyard for a surveyor to verify compliance. I had already experienced these notices, but something about this one felt different, more urgent, more invasive. I called the HOA office, but the receptionist claimed no one had sent it. Karen, predictably, was in meetings all day. That should have been my first warning. Over the next few days, subtle signs emerged. Neighbors I had once trusted, neighbors I had shared Sunday barbecues and gardening tips with, seemed wary around me. Conversations stopped abruptly when I approached. Side glances and polite nods replaced the casual warmth that had defined the community. Curiosity mixed with unease, and I decided to investigate quietly. I started with public records, digging through deeds, permits, and zoning documents. It was tedious work, but something about the calm, methodical process was satisfying. And then I found it, a series of property transfers that made no sense. Small plots of land, parcels that technically belonged to private owners, had somehow been reassigned in HOA records. Boundaries had been shifted subtly, a foot here, a few inches there, enough to encroach on private property without triggering obvious alarms. It hit me slowly. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about visual harmony or uniform landscaping. This was about control. They were quietly extending their reach, slowly annexing whatever they could get their hands on. I dug deeper and found that Karen had been orchestrating deals in the shadows. She had approached several neighbors, offering incentives to reassign property rights, promises of exemptions, lower fees, or even cash, all in exchange for aligning with her vision of control. Most neighbors complied quietly, fearful of losing social favor or being fined. The shock wasn't immediate. It was the creeping realization that my life had been micromanaged, my choices limited, and my home treated as a chess piece in Karen's game. Every fine, every letter, every seemingly arbitrary complaint suddenly made sense. It was no longer about decorum, it was about power. The final piece of evidence came on a rainy Thursday. I was walking along the edge of the creek behind my old home when I noticed a surveyor van parked near the northern boundary. Curious, I approached, pretending to be inspecting the trees. One of the surveyors, distracted, left a folder open in the passenger seat. Inside were maps, annotated with the precise measurements of my property, my backyard, my deck, even the small flower beds I had planted years ago. Boundaries were being manipulated, lines redrawn, and notes indicated that Karen intended to expand HOA claims into areas that were clearly private. I remember standing there, rain soaking my jacket, staring at the folder. Disbelief washed over me. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but I didn't let it rise. I folded the papers carefully and slipped them into my bag. I needed to think. I needed a plan. That night, I sat in my living room, the rain drumming softly against the windows, and I spoke aloud, mostly to myself, I won't fight in anger. I'll wait. Waiting wasn't easy. Each day brought glimpses of HOA overreach, neighbors suddenly quoting obscure clauses, a driveway realigned without consent, fences officially extended. But I remained calm, silent, and observant. And then I realized something that made my pulse quicken. While the HOA had power over the neighborhood, they had no jurisdiction over the land outside it. The untouched lake. The quiet plot at the edge of Willow Creek. It was technically private property, beyond their reach. My mind raced as I imagined what could be done. The betrayal wasn't just about the HOA taking over lines on a map. It was personal. Karen had weaponized trust, friendship, and bureaucracy. She had pushed entire families into compliance and isolation, all while maintaining the veneer of civility. And I had been caught in the middle, quietly, painfully, subtly. But now, I had leverage. I had proof. I had patience. And I had a piece of property that could turn the entire game on its head. I spent nights poring over documents, cross-referencing land deeds, and speaking with legal experts under the radar. Every conversation, every notation, every quiet observation built a mental blueprint. I wasn't angry in the way most people imagine. I was precise. I was methodical. Like a chess player, I was setting my pieces, preparing for the moment when Karen would finally realize she had underestimated me. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be about shouting, threats, or confrontation. It would be quiet, elegant, and absolute. They had no idea what was coming, I whispered to myself, closing the folder and staring out the rain-streaked window at the darkened lake beyond. The first step had been taken. The trap was invisible, and the timing was mine to control. Karen thought she owned the neighborhood. She had no idea that the game had already changed. Once the betrayal became clear, I understood that anger alone wouldn't win this game. This was about strategy, patience, and quiet precision. I had to think like Karen, but smarter, subtler, and with the law firmly on my side. The first thing I did was secure the lake. The moment I signed the deed, I felt an unfamiliar power, the kind that comes not from wealth, but from control over something truly untouchable. It wasn't just water, it was leverage. And leverage was everything. I spent weeks visiting the county records office, scanning through old plats and property transfers, verifying that every boundary line was correct. Each hour of meticulous research added clarity. Lines were precise, ownership absolute, and the HOA had no legal foothold. Every subtle encroachment Karen had attempted was documented, every overreach recorded in maps and old permits. I photographed everything, created a digital archive, and cross-referenced each note. Late nights were my domain. My laptop glowed in the darkness, stacks of legal books beside me, browser tabs open to municipal code and property law. I wanted to know the exact ways the HOA could try to manipulate claims, and more importantly, how they could be exposed. It was like reading a manual on their weaknesses, invisible to them, but clear to me. I even reached out to a lawyer under a pseudonym, explaining the situation without revealing my identity. She confirmed my suspicions. Karen and the HOA had no legal claim to the lake or my bordering property. Any attempt to use intimidation or pressure tactics would be easily countered. I felt the calm satisfaction of knowing the rules were on my side. Next came the observation phase. I watched the neighborhood from the edges of the lake, pretending to fish or take photographs of the scenery. Karen was predictable. She checked her watch at precisely 7:30 a.m., walked her dog along the same route, and lingered near the edge of the lake more often than necessary. Meetings were publicized, but private discussions always occurred after the formal sessions. Every move she made was catalogued in my notebook. Every ritual was noted. Then I began the tactical work. I drafted a plan to subtly assert my rights without provoking confrontation prematurely. First, a dock. Nothing extravagant, just a sturdy wooden structure extending into the lake. It was legal, within my property boundaries, and most importantly, it could become a revenue source. Not a malicious one, but a smart one. I installed a small sign, simple, polite, professional, private property, dock use fee required. I also spoke with the neighbors quietly. Not all were complicit with Karen, and some were quietly frustrated with her control. Without revealing my full intentions, I encouraged them to consider what it would mean if the lake truly became private. Curiosity and fear rippled subtly through the community. Karen noticed immediately, her posture stiffening as she drove past the new dock. Every document I had collected was organized meticulously. A binder for deeds, one for survey maps, one for HOA correspondence, and another for photographs. The goal was simple. When the time came, I could demonstrate with unassailable clarity how the HOA had overstepped, how boundaries had been manipulated, and how Karen's authority had been based on control, not law. Each night, I rehearsed my approach quietly. How I would remain calm if confronted. How I would respond if neighbors asked questions. How I would use the dock not only as leverage but as a symbol, the first point of visible, undeniable authority that Karen could not challenge. I also prepared contingencies. If Karen tried to gather signatures, I had proof that she had coerced neighbors. If she attempted legal intimidation, I had a lawyer ready with all documentation. If she tried to publicly shame me, I had media contacts ready to highlight the story of bureaucratic overreach versus individual rights. By the time the dock was finished, I felt no satisfaction in revenge, only in certainty. Karen's rules didn't apply here. Her authority stopped at the property line. I had transformed frustration and betrayal into careful, controlled power. And from my vantage point at the edge of the lake, I could see her first glance of recognition, that silent, shocked pause when she realized I was no longer just a passive target. It was a quiet victory, but one that would ripple through Willow Creek Estates in ways she could never anticipate. They had no idea what was coming, I repeated to myself each night, not with anger, but with calm assurance. The pieces were in place. The board's arrogance was its own undoing. And soon, the moment would arrive. The morning Karen first realized the dock was complete, she didn't storm over in fury. She didn't even knock. She stopped at the edge of the lake, frozen, staring at the polished wood stretching into the water. The sign, simple, professional, indisputable, read, private property, dock use fee required. I watched from a distance, leaning against a tree, coffee in hand, calm as the water. She had always thrived on fear and compliance, but now, for the first time, she had neither. A few days later, letters went out. Not angry or threatening, just legal notices detailing property ownership, the dock's legitimacy, and the right to charge fees for use. The language was precise, professional, and impossible to dispute. I included maps, photographs, and copies of every relevant deed. The message was clear, the lake was mine, entirely, and the HOA had no jurisdiction. Karen tried her usual tactics. She called meetings, demanded explanations, and tried to rally neighbors. But the room felt different this time. There was no fear, only curiosity. Each neighbor glanced at the dock across the lake, then at me calmly observing from my property line. Some shifted uneasily, remembering how many compliance requests had been coerced or manipulated in the past. The balance of power had quietly shifted. The first confrontation happened in person. Karen marched up to the dock one Saturday morning, clipboard in hand, voice sharp and accusatory. "You can't do this. This lake is private property," I interrupted, smiling lightly. "All ownership is verified. You may use the dock, yes, but under the posted terms. Fees are optional, but required for regular access." Her face turned red, a mix of fury and disbelief. She muttered something about HOA rules and bylaws, but I calmly handed her the binder, all maps, deeds, and legal confirmations neatly organized. No argument. No shouting. Just undeniable evidence. The tension escalated when a few neighbors tried walking past the dock without permission. I stopped them politely, explaining the rules. Some grumbled. Others realized the lake's freedom was no longer theirs to take. Whispers began circulating through Willow Creek Estates, Karen had overstepped, and now her power was symbolic, not actual. The most satisfying moment came a week later during the HOA board meeting. I attended as a silent observer, quietly taking notes while Karen attempted to assert her authority over the lake. She was met with polite but firm questions. Can the HOA legally claim jurisdiction here? Are the boundaries verified? The board shuffled papers, faces tight with unease. I could see the realization dawning, the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. By mid-afternoon, Karen's composure cracked. She tried one last tactic, appealing to fear and tradition, reminding neighbors of community rules and precedent. But each point was met with polite corrections from residents who had quietly reviewed the deeds and maps I had shared. The room's energy had shifted from blind obedience to empowered clarity. Soon after, I formalized access. A small fee structure for dock use was introduced, professionally managed, and openly posted. Not vindictive, not petty, just a logical consequence of private ownership. The board and Karen had no legal standing to object, and the lake became a peaceful, self-contained retreat accessible under my rules. The poetic justice wasn't just in the legal victory, it was in the calm precision of it. Karen, once untouchable, now faced the reality that control and fear are fragile tools. I never shouted, never threatened, never acted out of anger. I simply used patience, clarity, and the law to create undeniable truth. That evening, I stood at the edge of the lake, watching sunlight glint off the water. The wind rustled through the reeds, birds sang softly, and somewhere in the distance, the HOA houses lined the shore like a silent audience. Karen's SUV sat idling, empty, a symbol of authority that had been quietly dethroned. I smiled. Justice didn't need drama. It didn't need violence. It only needed patience, foresight, and quiet resolve. And for the first time in years, I felt peace, true peace. The weeks after the dock went up were quiet, almost surreal. Willow Creek Estates carried on with its usual routines, but something had shifted beneath the surface. The neatly trimmed lawns and polished porches were still there, but the unspoken fear that once kept the neighborhood in line had begun to loosen. I could sense it in glances, in hushed conversations at morning jogs, and even in the small smiles of neighbors who had once feared Karen's scrutiny. For Lena and me, life felt lighter. Mornings were spent on the dock with coffee in hand, the lake stretching wide and undisturbed before us. Ducks glided along the water, and the reflection of the sky in the ripples reminded me that freedom, like water, could be quiet but unstoppable. We weren't seeking revenge in the traditional sense. There were no public confrontations, no angry speeches, no vindictive chaos. Our justice was the simple, undeniable truth, a private lake, respected and protected, and a community slowly learning that authority must be accountable. Some neighbors approached, cautiously at first, then with warmth. They thanked me, subtly at first, for proving that compliance and fear weren't the only paths. Others avoided confrontation entirely, choosing to abide by the dock rules rather than test the legal boundaries. Karen herself kept her distance. She never admitted defeat, but the tension in her stride and the careful wording of her letters spoke louder than words ever could. Reflecting on it, I realized that the ordeal had changed me more than anyone else. I had learned patience in a way that anger could never teach, the value of observation, and the strength that comes from knowledge. Justice isn't always loud or immediate, sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and deeply satisfying because it allows the natural order of truth to reveal itself. The lake became more than just a symbol of legal victory, it became a sanctuary. I installed benches along the shoreline, planted wildflowers where Karen could not dictate, and maintained the dock not as a tool of intimidation but as a reminder of what careful, thoughtful action could achieve. People respected the boundaries without fear, and in that respect, I found a unique satisfaction. On particularly still evenings, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the water glowed like liquid gold, I would sit at the edge of the dock and think about the journey, from the first HOA letter to the final confirmation of ownership. Each obstacle, every underhanded attempt at control, had been transformed into an opportunity for calm, intelligent justice. And in that transformation, there was a lesson: power without fairness is fragile, and patience combined with knowledge is invincible. As the seasons changed, the lake remained constant, a quiet witness to the lessons of human behavior. Karen's rules no longer reached here, and the HOA's influence had limits that even they could not cross. I had learned that protecting what is yours doesn't require force, it requires strategy, foresight, and sometimes the courage to wait for the right moment. And so, as I watched the last streaks of sunlight disappear behind the trees, I whispered to the wind, almost like a benediction: true peace is earned, not demanded. And sometimes, the quietest victory is the loudest lesson of all. If you enjoyed this story of calm, calculated justice and the poetic satisfaction of smart revenge, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. There are plenty more HOA stories and real-life tales of clever, emotional triumphs waiting to inspire you.